Okay, hi all. I'm getting us to think about the common question we looked at a bit last week, why lecture or why not lecture? And I'm asking you to refigure it into this question. It's our question. Why not pedagogy? Why not think of pedagogy as the basis from which to answer a question about why lecture, why not lecture, why do any other thing? And I want you to remember that in terms of pedagogy, we talked about it as a bit of a mashup, that you're bringing together not just questions about the art and science of education or thinking about whether you're doing a range of teaching for the development of a human being fully, or if you're thinking about skills, or if you're using a particular educational theory or theorists framing your class. But you're using a mashup, your own blend, your own mix. There'll be two or three things which you'll overlay with your own understanding. And that becomes your mashup, your pedagogy. So we'll be thinking of pedagogy in those kinds of ways. Also, as reminders, we talked about learning and learners last week, and which do you want? That we want the agentic learners as we talk about that transition in practice and in thinking of students, less so in our classes because we might think of them as those passive receptors of our teaching, of our educating. So students with educators, teachers with learners. I want you to really begin to think about learners as capable of learning with others, the multiple resources, and the resilient creativity, agentic learners. And I want you to remember, again, pedagogy helps us think about learners because it reminds us that they've already come having learned something. The to learn happened before us. Often with us, they're in that mode of unlearning. Or providing new information, new frames. They have to look at gaps in their thinking, gaps in their learning, gaps in their that produce misconceptions, and then reframe things. So again, we're thinking about learning when we're thinking about pedagogy in order to answer particular questions. Another thing in thinking about why pedagogy is that it lets us think about course design in a way that lecture doesn't. I'm going to lecture. What's that mean? How do I design around that? We often don't think about that. But if I'm going to teach and if they're going to learn and maybe teach at the same time, what am I going to learn? That agentic sort of questioning. We need course design, and we need these things to fold together. What's the atmosphere we're creating? What's the atmosphere in which we exist? What are the aims, the activities, the assessments? These all draw in Biggs and Tang, and we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But folding this together, there is a certain energy. The aha comes on. Notice that this fold, this triangular, three-dimensional triangular thing, there's the light coming out, the knowledge that's produced, the aha. That's another reason we want to think about pedagogy. One other way to pursue this thinking about pedagogy and the light in the middle is to think of yourself again as the teacher, them as the learner. Sometimes them as the teacher, others in the class as learners, you as a learner, and the knowledge that gets produced in that atmosphere. This is from David Lusted, who's talking in 1986 about why pedagogy, and paying attention to learning as what happens when the teacher and the learner come together to create new knowledge. There's that aha moment, the ideal impact, where things that they understand splash up, and sometimes they have to dig back deep in and reflect on those things. We want that when we think about pedagogy. Lectures don't always cause a splash up. They might cause a waving over, a washing over, maybe even a drowning at times. But at times they can create that splash up. They can create moments where people get to dig in deeply. So again, pedagogy helps us think about why we're doing that. All of this means you might need to change some of your priorities. It's not just delivery of content, because if you think about it honestly, can you ever cover all the content again? Ever. People need to know how to look for understanding, how to develop insights, how to build new knowledge. So change priorities come about if we're thinking about pedagogy rather than lecture, or using pedagogy to determine when we lecture, when we do group things, when we do the combination of the two. Part of this rethinking is helping ourselves and each other and our students to think about assessment, sitting beside. The word assessment has its root in this Latin word that I have up here, the sit beside, sit in counsel, assist somebody. And a couple of things that you might think about in this sitting beside mode is, how do students work together when they're sitting beside one another? That's a pedagogical question. How do you sit beside your students even when you're in the front of the room, to think with them, to ask them to share their thinking, to make some meaning together, to maybe problem solve a bit, take a pause, see their learning. Let them show you what they're understanding so that you can redirect, reframe, congratulate, appreciate what's going on. so that you can be present as a supporter. This sitting beside is also sitting beside your field or your profession, moving things along, not being a gatekeeper to keep things back, but being a gatekeeper to move things ahead, to make new things possible. So think of it as sitting beside, wherever you are in location to your students, in a room, in a virtual or online place, or face-to-face. Another part of the change-up is, again, thinking about control differently. Often people go to, this is why I lecture, to get information out. I know that they're getting what I want them to get. But do we really know that? What's going on in their heads? There is, the person who's asking for a dinner date. There's the person who's worried that they failed the test you just handed back. Person who's lost because they're watching the screen and keeping track of the text and also taking notes. And then there's that person who gets it. But you might only notice that because of their look. Wide-eyed and appreciative rather than wide-eyed and confused. We don't always know that students are receiving what we're sending or transmitting in a lecture mode. And some people are more worried that in a group discussion mode they don't know because they don't see what's happening in the groups. Well, pedagogy says, as it would with lecture, how do we open that up? How do we see it? How do we do different things? So those two modes, often in discussion we have students create and reflect, but we don't listen to them, have them tell us what data they gathered or what share information so people can gather more data from each other and then test it out. In lectures, we often gather the data and test it without having time to reflect or create. And what I want to propose to you all as you're thinking why pedagogy is we need to do all four of these things. And this particular image links to one of the readings in your Jigsaw in the coming week, to the Zull article. So, thinking differently might lead you to look at a group-based activity differently. Now here's an example of group-based activity, and this is, would you believe, during a final exam. Rather than having students in a final exam write individual papers or draw individual course proposals in this case, I asked my past 8101 students to continue working in teams that they'd been in, base group teams throughout the semester, to do the capstone of designing a unique, novel, interdisciplinary course. So they had 2 hours to do that, and we had a half an hour of debrief to talk afterwards about why this kind of testing might work as opposed to something more traditional that might come out of a lecture base, which would be a sit down, take the test, blue book, fill in the blanks. And what you see here is them in that production mode where they're talking to each other in small clusters in their team, trying out ideas, then taking some time to reflect on it and then presenting. You'll notice in the presentation picture at the bottom, people are up front and looking carefully and closely, not just because the print is small, but because they want to know. What you don't see here is people from each team coming up to the other team working and saying, hey, that's a great idea. How did you develop it? Why are you using that? What you can't hear is me saying, that's a really interesting verb choice here, but I don't see how your assessments support it. Can you go back and think pedagogically how you're going to align all these things and what activities are going to happen? So again, I was able to see and hear and be part of their thinking, and they were able to see and hear and be part of each other's thinking. So across the groups, they taught each other, even in our final exam. That's part of the change up, the change priorities. It's part of why I ask you to consider pedagogy. Pedagogy has us look at roles differently. The instructor as a facilitator, mentor, guide, cousin in my metaphor, if you will. The content as being things to uncover and discover and developing skills and creating new knowledge. And finally, pedagogy also asks us to consider actions. Learners as active discoverers and the community in which they're working as interdependent with peers, co-creators, and with us. The community includes us in sometimes an egalitarian role as co-creator. All of this may leave you in the mode of being a scallywag within your department, someone who sees you as a traitor, and we'll talk some more about that when we talk about Stephen Brookfield and learning. But for now, go to your readings. You each have one assigned to you from the 4. There are 3 videos that you will look at to further pursue these lines of thought, and then you have a bit of active reading to do for the week. That's also described at the closing of this memo. Thanks for your attention during our little preamble here in the transition between week 1 and week 2.